Hello, my name is William Wood. This is Week 7, Sociology of Crime. This week, we'll start our discussion of social process theories. Social process theories, this is a larger umbrella concept often used to encompass social learning theories, which we'll look at in more detail this week, but also labeling theories, which we'll look at next week, as well as social control theories that we'll look at later in the term. So for this first of the two lectures this week, we'll look at this first point here. What are social process theories? Let's go ahead and get started. Social process theories are theories of crime or behavior that are based on processes of socialization. What we mean by this are the interaction that people have with various organizations, institutions, and processes of society. So critical elements of socialization from a sociological standpoint include family, of course, parental efficacy, collective efficacy. This is a concept that we've looked at in our discussion of social disorganization theory, particularly the work of Rob Sampson and his colleagues at Harvard University. Also things like the media, peer relations, institutional involvement, the role of institution in socialization, particularly in young people's lives, things like religion, education, and so on. So social process theories look to processes of individual socialization to help explain why people commit criminal or deviant acts. These theories suggest, contra to social structural theories, some of which we looked at last week, that people of all social classes or socioeconomic status have the potential to become delinquent or to commit criminal acts. This takes us back to the work of Edwin Sutherland that we looked at in Week 1 and his concept or his definition of crime as social harm. Remember, Sutherland set forth a broader definition because at this time he was aware and he was beginning to research the crimes of the upper class, things that he came to call white-collar crimes. Also, crimes of professional thieves and other groups that did not typify what was commonly thought of as crime as a lower class problem. So Sutherland's research is important, as we'll look at a little bit later in the second lecture this week, in terms of advancing theories that sought to explain why people of different social classes or different socioeconomic status might engage in criminal behavior. The criminologist Larry Siegel notes the influences of social process theories have endured because the relationship between social class and crime is still uncertain. In fact, if you remember from Week 2, we looked at the evolution of self-report data on offending, which told us really from the late 1940s onward that the once strong relationship between poverty and crime or low socioeconomic status and crime that was assumed throughout much of the 19th and early 20th century became more problematic towards the middle and latter part of the 20th century. We see a greater distribution across different socioeconomic strata than we previously did, only when we had access to official data. So social process theories, in some sense, may look similar to some of the other theories that we've looked at, particularly psychological trait theories. There are, however, some notable differences that really make them more sociological than psychological. So trait theories, for example, tend to be more positivistic, focusing their use on the scientific method to uncover pathologies, where social process theories tend to focus more on the social construction of meaning between individuals and their socializing factors. So this leads to situations with trait theories where the function or the goal for people who are pathological, the goal is clinical diagnosis, treatment of psychological disorders, etc. Social process theories are not clinical, so they don't seek to diagnose or treat people. Both trait and social process theories look at socializing factors such as family, peers, schooling, etc. But social process theories often take a more critical view of these socializing institutions. And we'll see this a little bit with our focus on learning theory this week. We see it much more in labeling theory and the recognition that the institutions charged with social control are in many cases the ones that create or amplify the deviance or the criminal behavior. So social process theories then often take a more critical view of socializing institutions, police, teachers, judges, their role in creating deviance or crime. So I mentioned briefly this concept of social process theory is really a larger rubric that encompasses three sets of theories. Social control theories, we mentioned very briefly in relation to classical criminology, but we'll come back to when we look at New Right Realism later in the term. Social learning theories, which we're going to look at in the subsequent lecture this week, and social reaction or labeling theories, which we'll cover next week. So the social learning perspective differs from others we've looked at in several important respects. Most importantly, it suggests that while people may or may not experience things like strain or pathology or other factors used to explain crime or deviance, participation in deviance itself is a learned activity, just as almost all activities in which we are engaged in. So in assuming that people learn deviance, this perspective takes a unit of analysis smaller than functionalism. Remember last week we talked about this notion of the middle range in Merton's strain theory. Right? Merton was seeking to make claims not about people at the individual level. He wasn't saying that his anomie theory or his social structural theory could predict individual level offending, nor was he saying that it could predict offending at the societal level. Right? It's a middle range, it's a strata, whether it's social class or socioeconomic socioeconomic status, a range. Now, social learning theory ekes in at a slightly lower unit of analysis. Here we're really looking at individuals or groups of various sizes, things like peer groups, for example, small groups or at the individual level, to explain why people learn and engage in deviance. Within the sociological study of crime, the origins of this theory really have their impetus with this guy here, Gabriel Tarde, the French social theorist who was critical of Durkheim, in fact. Remember, we looked at Durkheim's arguments last week. Tarde disagrees with Durkheim's notion that society is greater than the sum of its parts. Remember, this is Durkheim's concept of the social fact. He's critical of Durkheim's notion of social facts. He doesn't think that society is something larger or separate from the collection of its members. And instead of proposing that things like crime or other social facts have larger social functions, Tarde proposes rather that people learn and they make sense of these through what we would now refer to as socialization. He calls it the theory of imitation, right, from which individuals learn deviance from others. This theory for Tarde had three parts, including one, this law of close contact, where he said the closer that one is to others that engage in deviant behavior, the more likely that they themselves will be to engage in this behavior. Two, the law of imitation of superiors. Those with more power, those with higher social status, are more likely to be imitated than those with less social standing. They're also less likely to imitate others. And three, the law of insertion. We might call this the shiny new toy law. Tarde believed that in his time, newer fashions, customs, norms, etc., were likely to win over traditional or customary practices. So we can think about this in some sense as having a lot of implications for the rise of youth culture, subcultures, etc. Tarde's work in some regard has come back in fashion, but for our purposes here today, in this lecture and the next one, I really present it more as background material. You don't have to know his work significantly other than to be able to recognize the influence that it has on the figure that we'll discuss at the beginning of the next lecture, Edwin Sutherland, and his development of differential association theory. So that concludes our shorter first lecture. The next one this week will be a little bit longer, but thematically it makes sense. So you'll have to bear with a slightly longer lecture for the next part than normal, but not too bad. Anyway, I look forward to talking to you in the next lecture, and for now, I hope you have a good day.